Good evening. So, according to Dave Wasserman of the Cook Political Report, the special election in Georgia in the 6th congressional district is basically concluded. It will not lead to an outright victory for the Democratic candidate, John Ossoff, who has gotten a ton of media attention, probably disproportionate to the import that his election would have for national politics. But nevertheless, the special election in this district has taken on a prominence in the media for some time now, and it was thought that John Ossoff, a 30-year-old, basically newcomer to electoral politics, might be able to pull off a dramatic win in a traditionally Republican district, but as it turns out, he fell short of the 50% threshold, and the race will be heading for a runoff in June, in which the Republican is probably favored, although it's a sort of a toss-up. So that is now the third national election since Trump's victory last November and the emergence of this political force known as the, quote, resistance. 3 elections have been held since that time, and all 3 have resulted in Democrats losing, or at least not succeeding in their goals. Those would be the Louisiana Senate race, the Kansas House race last week, and the Georgia House race today. So why isn't it that Democratic angst and liberal discontent isn't translating as yet into tangible electoral victories? Well, here's one potential reason. So, as Jeff Stein at Vox notes, the discrepancy in fundraising was staggering for this particular race in Georgia. He notes that Democrats usually raise $10,000 for this seat and barely even contest it. But this time, the Democratic candidate Ossoff has $8 million, actually $8.2 million. 8.3 million. So that's a huge amount of money, and where is that money coming from? According to the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, 95% approximately of Ossoff's donation have come from outside Georgia. So never mind that district. 95% is coming from outside Georgia. So what does that tell you? Well, it sort of indicates that there are people with money who want to do what they can to further the resistance narrative, but they are being maybe misled into throwing that money at races that aren't really suited for those sorts of efforts. Now, it was thought because this particular district is trending Democratic, and it has a lot of affluent Republicans, some of whom were not so keen on Trump, that this could be fertile territory for a Democratic upset. And a lot of people thought that they could deliver a blow to Trump. So if you're in Beverly Hills, or you're in Manhattan, or you're in Fairfax, Virginia, you might think, hey, I got some money to spare, and I'm going to send John Ossoff, this bright and up-and-coming young man in Georgia, some money so he can defeat the Republican there. And this race was to replace Tom Price, who was named Secretary of Health and Human Services by Trump. But it didn't work. And what I think that indicates that you actually need a grassroots, localized movement to develop the political framework that a successful candidate can emerge from. John Ossoff doesn't even live in the district. He doesn't reside in the district. Now, that might seem sort of trivial. Yeah, maybe he lives, a couple miles outside the boundary and he's still connected to the district for whatever reason. But, I mean, that's just basic political ineptitude. Obviously, however trivial it might be, it's going to be used as a political cudgel, and it was because Trump, tweeted about it today, and people who live there could just be vaguely resentful of the fact that you can't be bothered to actually formally reside in the district that you're running to represent. So, Ossoff was just bizarrely incompetent in that arena. He has a pretty rational explanation for why he doesn't live there now. But if you don't live there, don't run. Let somebody else run. Anyway, so that is the outcome of tonight's festivities. And what return did Democrats who were giving tons of money to these efforts get on their investment tonight? Well, we don't have a final count yet, but it looks like Ossoff will get around 48% of the vote, and that compared with the Republican tally, and again, these are going to be variant. These are going to vary somewhat as the results come in, but that'll roughly equal. But if you compare Ossoff's share of the vote to the total Republican share of the vote in this race, it'll roughly equal the Trump versus Clinton margin in November of last year. So even though this district is very fertile grounds for Democrats, even though it's demographically and socioeconomically trending toward where Democrats should be favored, for some reason this particular campaign, notwithstanding all the media attention, didn't succeed in capitalizing on that. Maybe it's because Ossoff is, I'm sure he's a decent enough guy, but he ran sort of a generic Democratic campaign, just sort of generalized anti-corruption, didn't have any strong message other than, he was opposed to Trump, but, what does that really get you? It seems as though the model ought to be in Kansas, where although Democrats didn't win, maybe they could have won if some more resources were devoted there, they did very tangibly close the gap, much more compared to prior cycles. Whereas the gap here wasn't particularly closed. So this, I think, ought to be seen as a failure. Democrats now are in this mode where every time they lose, they have a convoluted rationalization for why the loss actually was a win. You just have to look at it through a certain interpretive lens, and then you'll discover that what appears to have been a loss was actually a victory. Well, a victory is when you actually win a race, and the race was not won here. What is going on? It's hard to say. Often these congressional races and special elections have their own idiosyncratic factors that don't necessarily extrapolate to national trends. Actually, if you go back in 2009, Democrats won an odd special election, including in upstate New York, but which wasn't a harbinger of 2010, because in 2010, as we all ought to remember, the Republicans had a huge wave. So it can be a little tempting to extrapolate too much from these discrete House races, but nonetheless, if there was such all-consuming fury about Trump out there in the populace, you would have expected this particular race to perhaps yield a victory for Ossoff. And although he got the most votes, he did not get enough to actually win the seat, and it's going to be another long, drawn-out race. Here's something funny that it was almost hard to believe that this was tweeted in earnesty or earnestness. It's funny, I used the word earnesty recently, and I was corrected that it wasn't a word. I think it probably actually is, but that's just an aside. Here is what Brian Fallon, one of my great pals from the 2016 campaign, had to say. He was Hillary's spokesperson or secretary or media hack or whatever you want to call it. And here's what he said tonight. Brian Fallon, quote, even if he doesn't hit 50 tonight, Ossoff is showing us the path to retaking the House. It runs through the Panera Breads of America. So, I mean, that's a ridiculous statement, but what is he intending to convey with that statement? Well, he seems to be intending to convey that where Democrats should direct their focus is on these swing, relatively affluent, Republican-leaning districts where Trump is relatively unpopular compared to a generic Republican. So Trump pretty starkly underran Romney in this particular district. He still narrowly won it in November last year, but he did underperform relative to Romney, and those were the areas that the Clinton campaign thought that they could hamstring Trump. And for a while, they were even talking about winning Georgia. They kind of abandoned that as the election approached. But the mindset that is exhibited by Fallon, I think here I should give everyone pause. First of all, why anyone would take any advice seriously from Fallon after his dramatic failure, humiliating failure, should be a career-ending failure last year, is preposterous. Obviously, his political instincts are faulty, and he ought not to be taken seriously as a viable commentator, analyst, prognosticator, what have you. And yet, he still has a huge platform, and people eagerly share his tweets and analysis and invite him onto shows and such. But basically, he's just carrying forth the approach that they used in the 2016 campaign to these congressional races. They think that they can just focus on the dislike of Trump within certain demographics and use that as sort of an in to get Democrats elected. And it just doesn't seem like that is nearly sufficient. I mean, Ossoff probably could have run this race. He had a huge financial advantage. He had a relatively low turnout race where there was a lot of fluidity and a lot of variance there that could have been utilized. But he didn't have a compelling enough program or platform to actually motivate people to turn out to vote. So the idea that just kind of micro-targeting these demographics is going to be sufficient, I think is a folly, and it does not seem accurate. I think a more interesting test will probably be next month when there's another special election. So if everybody has kind of special election fever, but next month there is going to be a special election in Montana for the at-large district, which is the district that encompasses the entirety of Montana, which only has one House district. And theoretically, there's no reason why Democrats should not be able to win there. They've nominated and elected Democrats to national elected office in the recent past, and also statewide office. So it should be doable. But we shall see. And the person nominated there by the Democrats is sort of a Bernie Krat. So he's not a generic Democrat. His messaging will be different. He'll be appealing to different constituencies, and I think he actually has a decent chance, but we'll see next month. So that's just some thoughts from tonight. Maybe I'll go get some Panera Bread to celebrate Brian Fallon's stupidity, or maybe not. Maybe I won't do that. Anyway, I'm going to be looking to get the final results out of Georgia, but we basically know what has happened, and that'll do it. Have a great night.